I'm going to be talking about the greening of religion hypothesis. The title of our series here is The Greening of Religion Hypothesis Revisited. An introductory overview, and since we are with such an erudite group here, I can skip over. I'm drawing on some material presented elsewhere, some overview material, and I'm going to skip over a whole bunch of it, which won't surprise you. For the uninitiated, you got to say something about Lynn White and his critique of Christianity and by default the Abrahamic traditions. I talk a little bit about the emerging religion and ecology field. But what I wanted to really start with today is how I began my own investigations in the 1990s. In fact, hopeful that the world's predominant religions, which I will call world religions for shorthand, might indeed be undergoing a significant greening process that would eventually lead to mobilization that I was convinced by the sciences was absolutely essential for the flourishing of earthly lives, including our own species. My efforts to understand the role of religion and environmental behavior has included orchestrating the ERN, founding the Society and the Journal, and trying to promote and facilitate such research. I've studied the scholarly and popular ferment about the role of religion and environmental behavior, as well as the growing body of social scientific research that purports to illuminate such relationships. I've been particularly interested in two aspects of such research. Firstly, claims that one or more of the world's religious traditions are more naturally environmentally friendly or more amenable to a green reconstruction than others, and the often related claim that religions, or some of them, are indeed becoming more environmentally friendly. The latter of these claims I've called the greening of religion hypothesis. Secondly, I've been keenly interested in historical and social scientific evidence that illuminates such claims. In 2016, I published the first of two greening of religion hypothesis articles that address these two questions. This one provides, I think, a benchmark overview of the scholarly and popular ferment over religion and environmental behavior. It demonstrated, among other things, that the ferment has been much longer and much more diverse than commonly recognized by those who perseverate on the Lynn White article. I cannot repeat this history today, and I must also bypass, unfortunately, a couple of very interesting examples, including delving into Ludwig Feuerbach and reviewing John Muir's epic argument in Cedar Keys, which I consider to be one of the greatest greatest essays in environmental letters ever, and it's also really funny. And so I'm going to move right to this question. What can we learn from history and social sciences about whether, and if so, to what extent the world's religions are becoming more environmentally friendly? 9 years ago, Gretel van Wieren, Bernard Zelaya, who's here with me today, and I completed an analysis after spending about 4 years regularly meeting of over 700 studies exploring religion and environmental behavior, the most comprehensive research review ever conducted, and given the labor involved, probably that ever will be. Our findings have held up well in the light of the relevant subsequent studies, in my judgment. My colleagues and I found that the weight of evidence is that those with profound environmental concerns within the world religions remain a distinct minority. When it comes to environmental understandings and values, religiosity is typically less important than other variables such as political ideology, educational levels, and the extent to which the wider society is secular. We heard similar data at this meeting earlier this week. All world religions, whether they emerge in Asia or the Near East, have themes and dynamics that include understandings of how environmental systems work. This tends to hinder pro-environmental concerned action. World religions co-evolve with agriculture. They are agricultural societies. Consequently, while they value domesticated plants and animals, they typically consider wild organisms as threat to their own survival. The review also revealed broad themes that hinder environmental mobilization among world religions, including, first of all, beliefs that a deity or deities control nature. This is one of the ideas that can include understandings of human impacts on environmental systems. Based on such beliefs, whether nature is harmful or beneficent is typically related to whether an individual or a group is properly aligned with God or the gods, or whether people are properly carrying out their religious duties. Consequently, to ensure a favorable environment, one must appease or please any deities powerful enough and indeed inclined to influence nature. Commonly, sacrifices of plants or animals are considered to be a way to please or appease the divinity. Sometimes those who are believed to be offending the deity must be converted or suppressed in some way. Given such beliefs, religious people often find it difficult, if not impossible, to imagine that negative environmental change, including catastrophic climate change, is the result of human behaviors, unless those behaviors involve disloyalty to the deity or violate a religious obligation, such as venerating Donald Trump. Secondly, world religions in their mainstreams are all deeply anthropocentric. They promote the notion that humans are exceptional, that they typically assume that humans are of greater moral value than other life forms. For the Abrahamic religions, humans alone were created in God's image, and they are to rule, to be regents or stewards over all other living things. For the Dharma traditions, human beings have achieved the highest spiritual pinnacle short only of enlightenment. And often religious and other people who could kill or tame wild animals were not vilified, but venerated. I surmise that assumptions about human superiority erode empathy for other species. This dynamic is, in part, because religionists are, generally speaking, loath to integrate evolutionary theory into their own worldviews because it tends to contradict their tradition's cosmogonies. This hinders recognition that we are kin, are biologically related to all other life forms, which tends to erode notions of human superiority and supremacy. Thirdly, world religions also tend to devalue this world by envisioning divine rescue from it, either promising extraplanetary post-death homes or transcendence from this world and its travails through spiritual practices or meritorious reincarnations. Also worth mentioning is that the world religions are, generally speaking, pronatalist, and therefore recognizing and addressing the role that our increasing populations, combined with the concomitant increase in the domesticated animals we raise as food or companions, plays in the many feedback loops that accelerate environmental decline. Religionists typically have a hard time acknowledging their animality and that there is no divine escape from the natural laws that govern the biosphere. There are, of course, many religious leaders who understand our environmental predicaments and think there are themes in their traditions that can and should lead to pro-environmental action. The weight of extant research, however, indicates that such leaders are not effectively using such themes to turn their traditions green. This is in part because religious leaders tend not to prioritize pro-environmental themes, values, and causes. We saw, again, earlier this week, more evidence of that. But why? Because religious leaders typically consider religious obligations to be more important. And understandably, religious leaders tend to prioritize meeting the immediate existential and personal needs of devotees. Moreover, such leaders often shy away from emphasizing themes that enjoin pro-environmental behavior for fear of alienating congregants who harbor conservative political ideologies or who believe that scientific cosmogonies contradict their religious beliefs. Fifthly, rarely do those involved in what some call religious environmentalism prioritize political activism towards systemic change. Environmental concerns tend to be restricted to acts of individual virtue, such as reducing consumption as an individual or within one's congregation. It is rare to hear official pronouncements that congregants should support the politicians and political parties that promote pro-environmental policies. Since the weight of evidence does not demonstrate that a dramatic greening of the world's predominant religion is underway, why do some express optimism about this possibility? As one who has been in and a close observer of the religion and ecology milieu since 1990, I have come to what I think are several plausible explanations for why one can easily gain the impression that the world's religions are mobilizing to address our environmental predicaments. Firstly, this is in part because of the impulse among religion scholars and leaders, especially those who understand the dangers posed by anthropocentric climate change and who recognize the importance of mobilizing devotees in effective response, to prioritize writing in normative and hortatory ways. These writers seek to use their expertise and social capital within the religious peoples and among the religious peoples with whom they have long associated to convince them that their religion enjoins environmental protection. Given such objectives, those advocating and asserting that the world religions are entering an ecological phase tend to downplay or ignore themes and practices that hinder environmental understanding and action. I've even heard some prominent religion scholars argue that it's politically counterproductive to focus on the evidence and reasons that the greening of religion is, at best, still nascent and anemic. Secondly, many lay people and religion scholars have a generally positive view of religion, or at least about their own traditions. This can lead them to fail to notice or to downplay and ignore the way religious beliefs and even religious ritualizing can lead to indifference to environmental causes and quite often also directly to environmental injury. We had a great talk by Juan Campo earlier this week about that. This is one path to what social scientists call confirmation bias. In short, people are more likely to notice whatever reinforces what they already believe or wish to believe than they are to notice disconfirming evidence. Another example of confirmation bias is related to a third dynamic, which is rooted in the desire to be hopeful. This also can lead people to fail to notice or to downplay discouraging evidence. Closely related to the above dynamic is how many scholars seeking hopeful signs that religionists are mobilizing to protect the biosphere tend to focus their research on positive examples and anecdotes. I term this tendency selection bias. All of this is understandable on a human level, for we all need hope. But it's unfortunate when scholars succumb to it, and many have. Claims about the greening of religion, for example, have generally not involved randomized data sets, but instead, they have typically relied on cases where religious individuals or small groups are demonstrably environmentally concerned and active. In short, much of the case for the greening of religion hypothesis is based on pre-screened positive examples or is otherwise merely anecdotal. Unfortunately, such information does not indicate what proportion of a given religious group has environmentally friendly ideals or behavioral practices, nor does it provide a comparative reference point with non-religious groups or other religious groups, nor does it track attitudinal and behavioral changes over time. Moreover, such information does not demonstrate that religion is responsible for environmentally friendly ideals and practices even where they are extant. Again, we have more evidence of that in this meeting. Much of the scholarship celebrating the supposed greening of religion fails to consider other possibly influential variables that may account for such greening where it can be documented. We should not, therefore, take at face value claims that the environmental concerns and practices of a given group are caused by their religious traditions' ethical ideals. Indeed, sometimes there's a defensive and apologetic motivation for such claims. Sometimes also a desire to be relevant and not lose young people who are often more concerned about climate change than their elders by showing that their traditions are relevant and can speak to those concerns. And of course, we ought to be mindful that many of those who study religious traditions are participants in them, sympathetic toward them, and have personal status and even economic interests that fuel the same apologetic impulses. Clearly, to evaluate the greening of religion hypothesis, a sophisticated social scientific approach is needed. But where do we see signs of what can accurately be considered green religion? Our comprehensive review found that indigenous societies, especially those that worked out and have managed to retain much of their traditional beliefs and practices, tend to value the entire community of life, consider non-human organisms as kin, and to develop ethics of gratitude and reciprocity toward all these relations. Such cultures, to use contemporary language, fuse traditional ecological knowledge with spiritual beliefs and practices into knowledge and practice systems that tend to produce sustainable livelihoods and prevent erosion of biological diversity. Some of this research draws on evolutionary group selection theory to understand how these societies often evolve in ecologically and socially adaptive ways. There's also some evidence that contemporary pagans are increasingly coming to understand that their spiritualities, which typically consider nature sacred in some way, ought to promote pro-environmental lifestyles and activism. This was a trend that Margot Adler in Drawing Down the Moon and Starhawk with The Spiral Dance sought to kindle when their books were published on the same day in 1979. As they both acknowledged, prior to that time, few pagans had been inclined to prioritize pro-environmental action. To my knowledge, however, there's been no quantitative research illuminating what proportions of the pagan world today prioritizes pro-environmental activities. Now, many more dynamics could be analyzed, a lot more nuance can be provided given this sweeping generalization kind of talk I'm doing today. But to wrap up this brief review of research focusing on world religions, we should not be surprised that religions that co-evolved with agriculture and did not unfold in ways that valued wildlands and wild creatures, especially those that prey on agricultural plants and animals, would not be inclined to be especially environmentally beneficent. Nor should we be surprised that since world religions were not invented to respond to environmental challenges, that they've not been inclined or able to mobilize their devotees to to respond effectively to negative, rapidly accelerating environmental changes. Although religions are malleable, they are not infinitely so, and thus so far they are not significantly mobilizing in response to planetary erosion of biodiversity, climate disruption, or even human health harming environmental pollution. But what about dark green spiritualities, which I've argued are spreading rapidly around the world, although from a small social base, and that are engaged in at least quasi-religious and science-embracing worldviews that do redound in ecocentric values and pro-environmental behaviors? While these are, in my judgment, salutary and becoming increasingly influential, what is clear from the present space and time is that the destructive inertia, both cultural and ecological, is far too strong. To wit, for example, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees reports that over the past decade there were approximately 220 million environmental refugees. Another study predicts that climate change will displace 1.2 billion people globally by 2050, pushing them westwards and northwards, from strained or collapsing economies toward regions with better life prospects, regions with better life prospects. Climate refugees have already been fueling right-wing populist, nationalists, and authoritarian movements. This dynamic will likely intensify, and if so, it will prevent effective collective action, whether religious or secular, light green or dark green, to minimize the accelerating decline of Earth's socio-ecological systems. As they have in recent elections in many countries, these right-wing movements often overwhelm efforts of anyone attempting to address the environmental crisis. In sum, neither green world religionists nor dark green religious naturalists are a match for the forces unleashed by the Industrial Revolution and the billions of consumers taking advantage of its opportunities or simply struggling to exist. It seems as though those of us who have hoped and studied the possibility that religious and quasi-religious actors would play a positive role in rising to the environmental challenge have been pissing into a catastrophic whirlwind. Now, I ardently hope I'm entirely wrong in these assessments, and I regret bringing Dr. Buzzkill to our wonderful society that is replete with earnest and good people who give a damn, and whose efforts I much appreciate, and whose hope I share and respect. Thanks for your time.